Okay, while we got you guys so quiet, I'll say good evening to you. Welcome to our class. We're sorry that some are not feeling well. We're glad to have you with us. We're glad to have some of you with us from home, live streaming with us tonight. This is our second session of our 4 that our elders planned for us to think about our congregational life and our special servants that the Lord gives us and wants us to have and that we need. And last week, if you remember, we thought about the presence of deacons. We'll do this tonight. Next time, we're going to talk about the practices of deacons. And then we'll have a question and answer time for the following week for any things that you might wonder about or want us to talk about more that I didn't think to bring up or that we didn't get to talk enough about in class. Remember that you can hand your questions to any of our elders or to Miss Sandy or to Josh or Justin or myself. We will, of course, allow for people to ask questions during that time if you don't get them to us ahead of time. But if you do it that way, you might not get as much of a researched answer as we could do otherwise. Tonight in 1 Timothy 3 will be, I wonder how many of you looked in the mirror at some point today. Would you volunteer to admit that you did? If you didn't look in the mirror, did you at least catch your reflection in the glass somehow, or on the bottom of your plate, or off the screen of the TV or something? You saw the reflection of yourself. Why do you do that? Why do you look in the mirror? Are you the kind of person who looks in the mirror to see what's wrong that needs to be fixed? Or do you look in the mirror in order to see what you would like to become? Do you ever wish the mirror could look back at you and the person in the mirror could tell you what you needed to become? I think when I think about the deacons in the Lord's church, and I remember a passage like Travis read for us a moment ago, I'm reminded that when we look at our deacons, we're looking at reflection of Jesus. When we look at what our deacons should be, we're looking at what we as a church aspire to be. Because after all, Jesus came as a servant. He said that those who are with him are going to need to be servants. His people, in other words, are servants. And if a passage like this gives us an idea of the ideal description of a servant, then there's a lot of us in these passages. So this doesn't just become an exercise that has to do with what somebody else who's going to do another job needs to become. This is about all of us, both in what we ourselves want to grow into and also what we look for to embody our service with our deacons among us. Let's start tonight with the impressions that we would like to pass along in this particular session, the impressions that we all would like to gain during this class. These are my 3 goals for it. And I hope that you'll kind of turn your imagination in this way. First, the passage that we're about to read is a description of ability to serve well in the role of deacons. I know we talk about this passage very often as qualifications, as if it were a list of things that we could check off and isolated from one another. You know, we get this one, then we get this one, we get this one. If we think about description of ability, we do better. Did y'all know I was once a coach of a ladies softball team? That's really true. My career lasted 1 season, and I got an award and resigned. How do you know, what I found out in that process is at some point in it, you have to sit down and figure out who is best suited to bat in which spot and who is best suited to play at which position. For example, who do you choose to bat first? Somebody who can get on base most, and hopefully somebody who can run a little bit. Who do you choose to pitch? To play shortstop? To play first base? You want somebody who can catch a ground ball and throw it at shortstop. You want somebody who can catch it when it's thrown at first base. You want somebody in center field who can catch a fly, and so on. So that idea is kind of what we're talking. We're not talking about a superior Christian, a more intelligent one, a better one. We're talking about one who's cut out for a particular role. Second thing, an impression to take is this is a whole picture of a normal person, not rare, super spiritual creatures that are hardly ever found, but this is a whole, and not just isolated qualities here, but a whole picture. This involves who someone is, someone's life, and then of a normal Christian person. And the third thing is the congregation's role in this process is really, really important. I'd like us to come away with that. The congregation doesn't have the luxury of having someone else to decide these things for it. The congregation has to decide, and then it has to work with those who are appointed and that kind of thing, and be partners in it. So we'll notice those three things as we go along. Now, when I was working on this class, that reminded me that there are immediately some challenges to this, or some obstacles to notice in pursuing these impressions here. One is, I think, pretty much a habit that we can have, the tendency to focus on authority rather than function when it comes to special workers in the church. And one thing you can say about a servant is the servant is not occupied with authority. He doesn't think of himself as being the boss of anything. He thinks of himself as is completing what the one he serves wants done, and doing it in a way that provides for the health of all of the people of the one he serves. I do think that sometimes this process is burdened down and weighted because we think that we're talking about someone who is going to bear authority, someone who's going to be over somebody else, someone who's going to be a boss of something. And therefore, that makes us defensive about who it might be, and that kind of, we're talking about servants. The second, and while I'm on this, I want to take you back then to what is the function. Remember last week at the end of class, we talked about what the presence of good deacons means among the Lord's people, and I took us to Acts 6. And I said that where deacons are present, there are unity builders, there are detail completers, there are team builders or mission enablers, there are morale setters, mood setters, there are growth encouragers. That's what I think you see present in Acts chapter 6. And that's what you're talking about. We're not talking about people to boss things. We're talking about people whose presence tends to make that the feeling, or that what goes on in a group of the Lord's people. So let's try to overcome that obstacle. There's an obstacle where we approach this with a self-will that has a special interest attached to it. For example, anytime we're talking about deacons, you pretty much can try to avoid any situation which begins with, if I were I would. The idea that I'm getting at here, Titus' focus is more on not self-willed for shepherds, But this is a situation where we approach with who can function in the way we've just described, and not simply with what agenda do we have that we'd like to make sure we have upheld. And then the third obstacle is wherever we might place an emphasis on one aspect of the description the Lord gives us here, with a disinterest in all the rest of these. I've thought of this, as you all know, I've been with the congregation here a long time now, and I have a bad habit of having saved almost everything I've ever written and never using it more than one time. So I look back, and a folder that I had when we did a question and answer time probably 25 years ago when we went through this process one time. And it's always an education on what you said then that maybe you wouldn't say now or something. But I noticed in that, I could almost guarantee you that the questions that we would get right now would be the same questions that we got back then. And a lot of times they'll have to do with something about the family situation or something like that, and we won't pay much attention to, does this person hold to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, or to what degree is this someone who is worthy of respect, or that kind of thing. So what I'm getting at is not to de-emphasize any of them, but to make them a whole picture, and not just one thing here or there that we focus on. All right, we'll run out of time. Let me move along here. So in our passage tonight, if we look in the mirror, here in 1 Timothy 3 in verses 8 and following, we're going to read a passage where there are 4 factors that this text asks us to consider in our thinking about who might serve our congregation well as deacons. And these 4 categories, as I think of it this way, just to manage the material and make it something more than just a word study, they have to do with self-mastery. How does a man have himself rule himself? Then faith convictions, and then his experience, whether his experience is accepted or is trusted by the church, and then his home life. And those 4 categories we'll try to consider as we go along. Instead of just reading the whole passage and then going back, let me read it one verse at a time here, one section at a time. The first section is in verse 8, and it has to do with the candidate, the proper, the one who's cut out for this work, as it might appear in with regard to himself and his inner life and his management of his own person. He's a person who has control of himself. And these 4 words, deacons likewise must be, and I'm reading the English Standard Version of this, we'll explain a little more. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. 4 qualities. The man's attitude toward himself and his own inner life described from these 4 perspectives. 1, dignified means worthy of respect. The King James translated it sober, I believe, or grave. Grave it is, isn't it? It's a word which means that he is respectful, that he's sensible, that he is a person who is mature in his ability to control his temper, his passions, his emotions. He has a handle on his inner person in that way. One of the versions says he is a man of high principle. And that's a good way to think. Not double-tongued. My way of saying it means that he doesn't talk out of both sides of his mouth. He is what he seems to be. He says he's real in that he says the same things regardless of who is around and regardless of what he is intending or what goal he is in pursuit of at the time. He's not someone who would ever lack the integrity to be himself, and he's not someone who would manipulate by means of words, not double-tongued, not two-faced in that way, not addicted to much wine, which means he's not occupied with or he's not prone to. One of the versions says, the kind of self-indulgence which causes him to lose control of himself. And I would say about this one, I think it has more application than just to wine. It would have to do with any addiction which impairs the person's ability to discipline himself and to make good choices, to be able to choose and then to follow through with choices. You know, there are a bunch of addictions in our world that are problems in lives these days. There are addictions to gambling. There are addictions to other drugs besides alcohol. There are addictions to sexuality. There are addictions to online things, including pornography. And any of those types of things would impair a man's ability to have healthy relationships and to discipline himself in an honorable direction. Some of these habits would be also things that would damage a man's reputation. It's interesting, in 1 Timothy, you get over in chapter 5, and Paul has to say to Timothy, no longer drink just water. Take a little wine for your stomach's sake. And I'll ask myself, well, why did he have to be told that? And I think that even though what might have been available for drink in terms of wine in those days would not have the same power that produced products like this would have now, simply because of the way they were produced. It still is the case that they could, you notice a person could be given to them, and then he loses the ability to rule his life. That's the point. Not greedy for dishonest gain, very much like the other statement, except now it's not wine that he's addicted to, it's stuff, it's possessions, it's money. The word for greedy means he's covetous. And dishonest means that he is so set on gain for himself that he's willing to pursue it in unscrupulous or dishonest ways. That, of course, would mean that this type of an individual would not be cut out to manage funds to help people or to help care for the church's property or to be trusted by individuals. Instead, the man is going to be generous and unselfish, and he's going to be honest, and he's going to be seeking the kingdom of God and his righteousness first. 4 inner qualities. What strikes you about those particular 4? Why would he choose those 4 to talk about a man's inner life? What strikes you that those would have in common? Can you tell me something that jumps out to you about that? All right, they involve ways of life. This is who a person is over time. Anything else? A man who could be trusted very, very much jumps out with this. Anything else that strikes you? Competent, all right. Confidence that people have in him. These seem to me to have all to do with either a man's hold on himself or with how he strikes the people around now, how whether he's worthy of respect from people, not to be controlled by anything outside of himself, but to be able to be respected by those and trusted by those outside of himself. That's an interesting thing to me about this. Then in verse 9, there's the man with regard to his faith conviction. He's to have a healthy and strong confidence in what God has revealed, and God's revealed truth. It says here, they must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. That's a brief summary of somebody's spiritual life, but it sure is has far-reaching implications if you think about it. Whenever Paul uses the term mystery, what does he mean? Does he mean mysterious? Or in Paul's letters, when he talks about the mystery of the faith, what does he generally mean? All right, it's what God has revealed. It's what God had in mind and what God has been doing that had not been revealed before and therefore was unknown, that no one ever would have guessed, but now has been made known by revelation. And a good verse about that would be Ephesians 3 and verse 6. And I think consistently in Paul's letters, Ephesians, Colossians, as well as here, that's the general. So that the mystery of the faith would be the content of what God has revealed, or the sum total of the gospel and all of its implications. And then to hold it would be to have a good understanding of it, a good grasp of it, and then a steadfast adherence to it. In fact, I found one of the kind of paraphrases which translates it, with a firm hold on the deep truths of our faith. That would be, and you think about what was said about confidence or trust, and this would be a factor in that way too. But he holds the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. What does he mean by that, do you think? He lives his life in keeping with the faith that the truth that he embraces. That there is integrity in his life in this way, that he's conscientious about whether what he's doing is in keeping with what God has made known. He's a person who adheres to what God has said in belief and practice, or at least is conscientious about trying to do that, and he would labor within the boundaries of what God has made known. And the people who know him would expect that he would do that. So in that way, there's a basic thing about this. This person is not just a person who gets things done, but he gets things done in keeping with who he is and in keeping with what God has said to his people. So that there's two aspects to it. Then the third one happens in verse 10. Now, here's what it says with regard to his experience and to the way the church accepts it and trusts it and approves it in this way. So what this verse says is, and let them, that would be deacons, also be tested first, and let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. I have found this verse translated in ways that give almost two different senses, and one of them leaves the impression that the deacons prove themselves, and the other line of thought is more that the church examines and approves of these brothers before they are asked to serve in this way. So Let me define the terms, and you make up your mind what you think of it. The ESV leaves one impression. New American Standard leaves a different impression. I lean toward the New American Standard's view of it myself. He must be tested first. The word for tested is the one the New Testament uses when it tells us to examine ourselves or to test all things or to hold fast what is good. This is the word that's used, like even with the Lord's Supper, where each one examines himself. It would mean that the role of a deacon is not assumed by someone who is untried in responsibilities. I think one thing it means is you look for people who are already doing things. Then it means, this is the way the New English Bible translates this, he must undergo a scrutiny. That would mean that he'd have to be the kind of an individual who would not mind his brothers and sisters deciding whether they believe he would fit in such a role. If he's tender or defensive about that, then he would have a difficult time in this way. His character and his beliefs and his gifts that he's demonstrated are things that his brothers and sisters are going to need to test. And then if he proves blameless, if he proves to be of good report, if it is the case that he's not reproachable, meaning that he has a good reputation and no public charge can be sustained against him, as one writer says, there's nothing to hinder his ability to serve, then it says let them serve, meaning approve it. Support that individual, encourage him, help him, work with him, strengthen him in every way you can, pray for him, help him be a success at it. That would be the idea in this word here. Time is making me move faster than I want to with some of this, so I hope I have your sympathy in that way. And then verse 11 is the one verse in this whole context about which there has been the most debate and argument. There's some ambiguity to it, it seems, although the translations don't always make that clear. This time with regard to the man's home life. Seems to be a place where there are maybe is more questions than any other area with this. What I think is here is you look for someone who has been a faithful and caring presence in his family. I think a congregation has to decide, in view of what they know about a man's whole life, about this one. I think we would like to simply make it literalistic checklists, and that makes us willing to look at numbers instead of actions or characters. Therefore, I think there's a challenge to all of us with this one here. So please notice that the reason for the ambiguity in verse 11, their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. The thing is, there is no there, T-H-E-I-R, in the original. The word for wives in the original language is the same word that translates women, depending on the context. American Standard Version translates the word women. ESV here and King James translates it wives, or maybe the New King James it is, translates it wives. And there's long-standing argument over which way it's to be taken. I might explain just a little bit, and we could take the whole class to do this part maybe, but those who believe that it should be translated women, sometimes then reason that this is a description of any female servants that there are within a congregation. And the reason for that is, as I say, that there is not present. The word for wives could be translated women. The word for likewise is found with regard to deacons in verse 8, and the must, it traces back to the must with regard to overseers in verse 2. So the reasoning would be that there were no wives mentioned in connection with the bishops in verses 2 through 8. And there were no qualifications given in that way, that these terms would, in the middle of the discussion of deacons, could be taken to refer to women also. All right, that's one way of taking it. Second way of taking it is that this word is found in verse 11 in the middle of a discussion of deacons, to which the writer returns in verse 12. And therefore, the context would suggest that it's calling for, or it's describing the wives of these workers. There are some who take it also that this is the point in which the wives of both groups of workers are described and that qualities are given with regard to them. I want to say it this way for our purposes here. The least that can be said about this is that the wives of deacons in this case, and of elders as well, have a huge bearing on the effectiveness of those servants. Aaron does a good job in helping us feed the homeless and do things like that, but he doesn't do it by himself. Miss Brittany does a whole lot of that, and that the same thing is true in so many ways. I do believe that these terms would be necessary and true for any Christian women that elders of a congregation ask to carry on any service, as they often do. We have people who teach. We have Miss Sandy in the office. We depend on our great ladies for a whole bunch of the things that this congregation does. These should be true in all of us. I call your attention down to chapter 4 and verse 12. As far as I can tell, there are no passages like chapter 3 verses 8 through 13 with regard to preachers, for example. They're not a list of qualifications like this. But chapter 4, the whole chapter is written to Timothy to talk to him about how he needs to be. And what it says in verse 12 is, present yourself as an example of a believer in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. And if you look at, that's awful similar to this. The women are to be dignified, the same word as with the deacons in verse 8, which makes you think of someone who's respectful, sensible, mature. They're not slanderers, and one paraphrase translates it, not devils, because the devil is a slanderer or the accuser of the brethren, you know. And the idea would be that this is a person who is not a malicious talker, who won't talk scandal, who will be able to control her tongue. Sober-minded means temperate or self-controlled and not likely to fly off the handle or to be unpredictable. Faithful in all things means trustworthy in every way. Now, the ones who think that 1 Timothy 3 and verse 11 is talking about the wives of these, and therefore the partners of these workers, point out that there is no use of the word deaconess here. In fact, that term, as far as I can tell, doesn't appear in the New Testament. A form of it is used with regard to Phoebe in Romans 16 and verses 1 and 2, but it's not used here, interestingly. And then the passage turns right back to the deacons, and it continues to talk about the family connection. So look at verse 12. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, a married man. And from my Greek teacher back in my college days, and I've told you this every time I tried to lead us through a discussion like this, his way of saying it is, this means a one-woman kind of man. And we ask, what does that mean? One woman kind of man, the husband of one wife. There is obviously here the mention of a person who represents the permanence and the stability of marriage, and he has a healthy relationship with his wife. What if there are special problems? What if someone has been through the death of a spouse? Or what if someone has been left not of his own choosing? That is a place, in my opinion, and I underlines my opinion, that's a place where a congregation who knows the whole story has to decide what's acceptable to it. What it can approve of honestly and faithfully with the Lord's Word. And we have to be able to talk to each other about these things, which calls for goodwill on the part of all of us, I would say. And then managing children and their own households well. Managing, some of the versions translate the word rule. It's a word which means standing before. In other words, he's able to take a healthy leadership role in caring for and loving his children, and he shows himself to have ability and good judgment in managing his own household. And once again, there are things said with regard to the eldership that are not said here. And the point is not that the man is always able to form the faith convictions for his children after they have grown. Or it's talking instead about his leadership of his love for his wife, his leadership and love for and care for his children, and his management of his household so that it is a good place to live. He does this well, and if you notice verse 13, he's therefore able to serve well, which is the point I think that we're getting at. All right, I heard the bell, so let me ask you to think with me just about 3 observations to kind of finish with here. There is authoritative guidance in this passage. This is what the Lord says is best to make someone able to function in his household this way. This is also a congregational decision. And what I mean by that is when I look here at dignified or worthy of respect Or if I look at someone who holds the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, or someone whose wife is dignified and the other, or temperate, or trustworthy in all things, or who manages his children well. Who does that perfectly? So don't we have to be willing to engage enough so that we can decide, whether someone is like this generally or not in a position for this? Yes, we do have to decide, all of us. So, and this needs to be done in the whole person context. I think this is an important part of this. This is not a disqualification list because it describes a whole person, and we have to decide whether someone is ready for that kind of a role yet or not. Remember that we're looking for normal and mature Christian men. They are. There'd be something wrong with us if we're a congregation who's lived and worked together for all this time and we haven't produced any men like the ones in this passage. Maybe we need to look at what our expectation is. So we're looking at an example of a believer, but a believer who's fitted for a deacon's role. And we want to hold the Lord's word up and know that this is what we're trying to become. So what we'd like to ask everybody to take with you, the impressions that we'd like to say, let's take with us from this, are the ones we started with. This is a description of ability to serve well in this role. It's a whole picture of a normal person, and the congregation's role in the process is really, really important. And I've talked for 40 minutes, and I really appreciate you bearing with us and hearing us for that time. Paul, would you mind to stand up and lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Father, we thank the Lord for the time you give us to come together, for the opportunity for sincere study. You would guide this church as we make our decisions, that our decisions would be yours. They would follow your will. They would take us where you would have us go. Father, we pray you forgive us. Pray you guide us. Pray for those members who are not with us today, that you give us strength. In the name of Christ we pray this.
Amen. Thank you all. Remember, if you have questions, you're welcome to jot them down.